1975. 59 aviation disasters happened in 1975, making it one of the worst years the skies had ever seen. Crashes weren't uncommon back then, but a few stood out for how shocking and heartbreaking they were. The first major tragedy came on August 3rd. A Royal Air Maroc charter flight, a Boeing 707, that had flown safely over a decade, was carrying Moroccan French workers home for the summer holidays. Everything seemed routine as the plane began its descent into Agadir. But thick fog swallowed the Atlas Mountains, and the pilots lost their bearings. The right wing struck a rocky peak, tearing off an engine. Within moments, the jet plunged into a valley below, breaking apart into scattered debris. All 188 people on board were gone. Investigators later concluded the crew had begun descending without confirming their navigation. In the darkness and fog, they had no real sense of where they were. Then, just over 2 weeks later, another disaster followed. On August 20th, CSA Flight 540, an Aviation IL-62 bound for Tehran, was making a stop in Damascus. Unlike Agadir, the skies were clear that night. But as the jet descended, it slammed into the desert just 11 miles from the runway. The impact was brutal. Of the 128 people on board, only 2 survived, having been thrown clear of the wreckage. Investigators believe the pilots had set the altimeter incorrectly, making them think the plane was 2,000 feet higher than it really was. Such a small mistake, but one no one caught in time. These 2 crashes, along with many others that year, carried the same lesson. In aviation, precision isn't optional. It's life or death. One slip in navigation or instruments, and hundreds of lives can vanish in seconds. And yet, as haunting as 1975 was, aviation still had darker days ahead. 8 years later, 1983 reminded the world once again how fragile air safety could be. 1983. The year 1983 pushed aviation into one of its darkest chapters. Planes were still the fastest way to connect the world, but that year saw a few dozen of accidents and over 1,000 lives lost. The first was Korean Airlines Flight 007, a Boeing 747 that departed Anchorage, Alaska on September 1, 1983, bound for Seoul. On board were passengers returning home after long journeys from New York. For hours, nothing seemed unusual, but the autopilot held a course that slowly drifted the jet off track, a mistake the crew didn't notice. Before long, the aircraft had wandered into Soviet airspace. Fighters were launched, and a missile strike brought the plane down. All 269 people on board were killed. A simple overnight flight had turned into one of the Cold War's deadliest flashpoints. Only weeks later, another tragedy happened, this time in Spain. On November 27th, Avianca Flight 011, a 747 Combi, was flying from Paris to Bogota, with stops planned in Madrid and Caracas. As it approached Madrid, the descent looked normal, but the crew had misjudged their position. Just 7.5 miles from the runway, the plane crashed into a hillside. The impact was catastrophic. Out of 192 people on board, only 11 survived. Investigators later pointed to pilot error, fatigue, and poor use of approach procedures. Together, these crashes defined 1983. One exposed how a navigational drift could spiral into a global crisis, while the other showed how a single miscalculation in the cockpit could wipe out nearly an entire flight. And as tragic as that year was, the one that followed would prove to be even worse. 1986. And when aviation was still recovering from the disasters of 1983, just 3 years later in 1986, another pair of tragedies shook the industry and left scars that could never be erased. On March 31st, Mexicana Flight 940, a Boeing 727, was on its way from Mexico City to Los Angeles, making stops in Puerto Vallarta and Mazatlan. On board were 159 passengers and 8 crew members. But as the jet climbed over the Sierra Madre Occidental, an explosion ripped through the left wheel well. A brake problem had caused a tire to overheat. The real issue? The tire had been filled with air instead of nitrogen, which made it flammable. Once it ignited, fire spread quickly, burning through hydraulic and fuel lines. The structure weakened, the tail section broke off, and within minutes, the plane went down in a ravine. All 167 people aboard were killed. Investigators later confirmed that the fire started in the wheel well and was made worse by improper maintenance. The crash led to sweeping safety changes, including mandatory use of nitrogen for aircraft tires, better wheel well ventilation, and heat detection systems designed to prevent anything like this from happening again. Just 5 months later, another disaster happened on August 31st. Aeromexico Flight 498, A DC-9 was flying from Mexico City to Los Angeles with a few stops along the way. As it descended toward LAX, it collided midair with a small private plane, a Piper PA-28. The Piper had entered Los Angeles airspace without clearance and didn't have the right transponder to show its altitude. It clipped the DC-9's tail, ripping off the vertical stabilizer. The jet flipped upside down and crashed into a neighborhood in Cerritos. Everyone on board both planes was killed, along with 15 people on the ground. The NTSB put the blame on the Piper pilot and the FAA, pointing to weak airspace rules and outdated equipment requirements. The DC-9 crew was cleared of fault. But out of this tragedy came big changes. Collision avoidance systems, TCAS, became mandatory for commercial airliners, and smaller planes were required to use transponders that reported their altitude when flying in busy skies. Yet even after these hard-learned lessons, the skies refused to stay calm. 1990. By the time 1990 arrived, aviation faced another round of disasters that reminded everyone how quickly order can collapse. Within 2 months, 2 disasters, the Guangzhou Bayan Airport collision in China and the crash of Indian Airlines Flight 605 in India, forced aviation authorities to rethink safety. The Guangzhou disaster began on October 2nd, with Xiamen Airlines Flight 8301, a Boeing 737, on a routine trip from Xiamen to Guangzhou. Midway through, a passenger stormed the cockpit, claiming he had explosives and demanded to be flown to Taiwan. Controllers ordered the pilots to land in Guangzhou instead, leaving the crew trapped between threats and official instructions. As the jet touched down, it went out of control, veering across the runway and slamming into a parked Boeing 707 before striking a Boeing 757 waiting for departure. The 737 flipped over and caught fire, igniting all 3 planes. When the flames were finally out, 128 lives had been lost. Investigators found the airport had failed to clear nearby aircraft and had given confusing guidance, mistakes that magnified the disaster. The tragedy led to China to overhaul its hijacking procedures, focusing on saving lives rather than negotiating with attackers. In India, another nightmare happened on February 14th. Indian Airlines Flight 605, an Airbus A320, was flying from Bombay to Bangalore with 146 people on board. The A320 was brand new, marketed as the future of safer flying. But during the approach, the pilots mistakenly selected the wrong descent mode. With engines idling, the plane sank too low, clipped a golf course, bounced into an embankment that tore off its engines, and then crashed into a slope where it burst into flames. 92 people were killed. The investigation blamed pilot error compounded by a confusing cockpit design. These were the 2 major accidents, but aside from them, 46 other crashes also occurred, destroying hundreds of families. 1991. By the time 1990 ended, it was hard to believe the next one would bring any peace. 1991 alone saw 27 military plane crashes and 54 passenger plane disasters. The first tragedy struck on July 11th, when a Douglas DC-861 operating as Nation Air Canada Flight 2120 for Nigeria Airways left Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, carrying pilgrims back home to Sokoto, Nigeria. The flight was meant to reunite families after Hajj. Then, everything went wrong. As the plane took off, 2 underinflated tires overheated and blew out. The burst sparked a fire in a hidden area beneath the floor. The crew had no idea it was spreading because the plane didn't have fire sensors there. One by one, systems started failing. Electrical power cut out, cabin pressure dropped, alarms went off. The pilots tried to turn back, fighting through smoke and chaos. The plane crashed before reaching the runway, killing all 261 people on board. Investigators found the problem started on the ground. The tires should have been replaced, but a project manager pushed the maintenance team to skip it because the flight was already late. That choice set off the chain of events that ended in disaster, exposing how rushing schedules over safety can turn deadly. The second crash happened in Indonesia on October 5th, when a Lockheed C-130H-30 Hercules took off from Jakarta after an Armed Forces Day event. It carried troops heading back to Bandung. Moments after takeoff, one engine caught fire. Investigators believe the fire damaged the wing controls, and when the pilots tried to return, the plane stalled and crashed into a Department of Labor building in a busy neighborhood. Out of 134 people on board, only 1 survived. 2 more people on the ground were killed. The investigation blamed the in-flight engine fire, though details about maintenance or other possible causes remained unclear. 1993. Looking back at 1993, it stands out as one of aviation's darkest years. 3 major crashes exposed different weaknesses, and together they showed how quickly things can go wrong in the air. The first disaster happened on February 8th and involved Iran Air Tour Flight 962, a Tupolev Tu-154M leaving Tehran's Mehrabad airport for Mashhad. The flight carried mostly pilgrims returning home after worship. As the plane climbed, 5 Iranian Air Force Su-24 fighter jets approached the airport in formation under visual flight rules. An air traffic controller mistakenly cleared them into the same airspace. In the haze after takeoff, the fighter jets collided with the Tu-154, tearing off its tail and rear engine. Both aircraft went down in a military compound near Shar-e-Codes, killing all 131 people on the airliner and both fighter pilots. The second crash hit Europe on November 20th. Avio impacts Flight 110, a Yakolev Yak-42 flying from Geneva to Skopje, had to divert to Ohrid because a blizzard shut down Skopje airport. On approach, the crew climbed too steeply, overshot the traffic pattern, and lost the VOR navigational signal while circling. Even with no runway lights in sight and flying off course, they kept trying to land. The Yak-42 crashed into rising terrain over Ohrid airport, killing all 116 passengers and crew. The third disaster involved SAM Columbia Flight 501, a Boeing 727-46 traveling from Panama City to Bogota with a planned stop in Medellin on May 19th. As it descended toward Medellin, a violent storm and broken navigation aids, including a VOR station disabled by sabotage, created a deadly setup. The crew believed they had reached the Abejorral beacon and dropped to 12,000 feet. They hadn't. The jet hit Mount Paramo Frontino at about 12,300 feet and disintegrated, killing all 132 people on board. Investigators blame both the pilots and air traffic controllers for misjudging position amid the storm and failing navigation systems. By the end of 1993, Midair collisions, navigation errors, and poor coordination had left a trail of wreckage and forced aviation authorities to rethink safety on every front. But the decade hadn't finished dealing its worst blows. 1995. 1995 hit aviation hard. 2 crashes that year showed just how quickly routine flights can turn tragic. The first involved American Airlines Flight 965, a Boeing 757-223 built for long, comfortable trips. On December 20th, 1995, it left Miami, Florida, bound for Cali, Colombia. Families, tourists, and business travelers expected a normal flight and a safe arrival in Cali after leaving Miami without trouble. But things went wrong on descent. The pilots followed instrument flight rules but drifted into mountainous terrain. They didn't realize they had veered off course until the jet slammed into a mountain near Buga, Colombia. Of the 163 people aboard, including 8 crew members, 159 died. Only 4 survived. Colombia's Civil Aviation Authority launched an immediate investigation. Officials discovered the pilots had selected the wrong waypoint in the flight computer. That single error threw the plane off its intended route and into dangerous terrain. Investigators stressed how easily pilots under pressure can misread navigation tools, especially in rough terrain with poor visibility. Communication gaps and procedural mistakes worsened the situation, leaving little time to correct the error before impact. The second crash came on December 18th, just days before the year ended. A Lockheed L-188C Electra, a 4-engine turboprop from the late 1950s, took off from Jamba, Angola. The plane operated a humanitarian charter, carrying refugees and supplies toward Kinshasa. Moments after liftoff, the Electra failed to climb properly. It stalled and hit a field only a few miles from the airport. Out of 144 people aboard, 141 died. Just 3 survived. Investigators quickly focused on overloading. The Electra carried far more passengers than it was certified for, and experts believe the weight crippled its climb performance. Some reports even suggested that shifting cargo added to the instability. With too much weight and too little altitude, the pilots had no way to recover before the plane went down. Both disasters revealed the same truth. When mistakes, pressure, and equipment limits collide, the results can turn deadly fast. 1997. As 1997 rolled in, more aviation tragedies sadly followed, taking the lives of passengers who never expected danger. The first was Garuda, Indonesia, Flight 152, an Airbus A300 flying a regular domestic route from Jakarta to Medan on September 26. People boarded for work trips, family visits, and everyday travel. The plane had a good record and had flown almost 27,000 hours in Indonesia's skies. But as it got close to Medan, thick smoke from forest fires filled the air and cut visibility to almost nothing. Air traffic controllers tried to guide the pilots, but they gave conflicting instructions. Miscommunication and confusion left the crew unsure of where they actually were. While descending through the haze, the jet struck a mountain near Sibolangit and broke apart in the jungle. All 234 people on board lost their lives. Investigators later said problems piled up at every stage. The smoke erased visual references, controllers mixed up Flight 152 with another plane, and the pilots misread their navigation points. Experts explained how unclear communication and bad instructions can overwhelm pilots, especially when weather forces them to depend only on instruments. The second tragedy was Korean Air Flight 801, a Boeing 747-300 that departed Seoul for Guam on August 6th. Passengers expected a normal long flight across the Pacific, but as the plane got closer to Guam, heavy clouds and rain hit the runway. The airport's glide slope system, the tool that helps guide planes down, was out of service, so the crew had to use a non-precision approach, which needs careful teamwork and constant checks of altitude. Instead, the crew lost track of their position, and the plane flew straight into Bija Peak. Of the 254 people on board, 229 died. The investigation by the NTSB revealed several problems. The captain made poor decisions. The crew failed to coordinate properly, and fatigue played a role. The airline also had weak training for these kinds of approaches. To make things worse, investigators found that air traffic control had turned off the minimum safe altitude warning system. These disasters made 1997 feel like a turning point, but the tragedies didn't stop there. Just 1 year later, 1998, delivered 2 crashes so shocking that they shook public trust in air travel all over again. 1998. The first major accident of 1998 happened on September 2nd, when Swissair Flight 111, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11 flying from New York City's JFK Airport to Geneva, Switzerland. Many passengers work for the United Nations, so people even called it the United Nations Airbus. The plane had flown safely for years, logging over 36,000 flight hours. But partway through the flight, the cabin smelled smoke in the cockpit. They thought it might be the air conditioning, but behind the ceiling panels, a fire had already started. It spread quickly, taking out one system after another. The pilots declared an emergency and turned toward Halifax, Canada to land. But the fire kept growing. First, the radios failed, then the instruments, and finally, the crew lost all control. The plane hit the Atlantic Ocean near Nova Scotia at high speed, killing everyone on board. Investigators later found that faulty wiring in the plane's new in-flight entertainment system started the fire. It lit the insulation that burned for several minutes before anyone knew what was happening. Shutting off the power actually gave the fire new paths to spread. It took investigators over 4 years to piece together the wreckage. Their findings led to new rules for wiring, insulation materials, and emergency procedures. Experts called it a confederacy of complacency, where small problems added up to a huge disaster. The other major crash of the year was on February 16th, when China Airlines Flight 676, an Airbus A300B4622R, flew from Bali, Indonesia to Taipei, Taiwan. As the plane approached Chiang Kai-shek International Airport, heavy rain and fog covered the runway. Air traffic control told the pilots to go around for another try, but the autopilot suddenly turned off. For 11 seconds, no one took control. When the captain finally pulled the plane up, he climbed too steeply. The jet stalled, dropped to the ground, and exploded after hitting houses and a road near the airport, killing everyone on board and 6 people on the ground. Investigators blame pilot error, poor training for go-arounds, and weak preparation for flying manually in bad weather. Together, these crashes made 1998 a year that shook global trust in aviation, and the years that followed would only bring more painful reminders of how fragile flight could be.